Hi, I'm Arsham, and this series of videos about computer science and game development are sponsored by Kitakode. I've started taking a course called CS50 made by Harvard, which gives you all the knowledge you need for computer science and game development. And this series of videos are summarized versions of that course. Feel free to check it out for yourself. Now on to the video. In this video, we're going to be talking about functions and their uses. First of all, what are functions? So a function in basic terms is a type of procedure or a routine. We have used functions in coding before, but we haven't really created our own. So far, we've used the main function, which you need to run your code with. But soon we'll have larger programs to run and we will need different functions so we can keep track of everything separately. Almost all programming languages let you write functions, although in slightly different ways. Another way of defining functions are with this diagram. So all functions should have an input, which leads to a procedure, and then an output. Another question is, why do we use functions? Well, there are three factors which can make using functions much better. One of which is organization. This helps because functions help to break up a complicated problem into more manageable parts. Another is simplification. It becomes more simple because normally smaller parts of code are much easier to design, implement, and debug. And our last one is reusability. Functions can be used again and again. All you need to do is write the function once. Okay, let's talk about declaring functions. There are three things you need to know about declaring functions: the return type, the name, and the argument list. The return type is what type of data type the function will output. Then there is a name, which is what you decide to call your function. And lastly, we have the argument list, which is a comma-separated set of inputs to your function, and each of which have a data type and a name. Let's take this function as an example. This should add up two integers. So we have a return type, which is an int, then we have the name, which is add two ints, and the parameter list, which has two inputs, which are both integers. Okay, so now that we're familiar with functions, let's get on to some examples. Okay, so let's start with our functions examples. And the first example we're going to do is adding two integers together. So let's try it out. So first of all, we need to include cs50.h. cs50.h in case we need it. And we want our regular old function, int main void. And this is basically the function we've been using so far, but now we're going to write our own. And normally, you would like the functions to be below. I'm going to teach you a way of writing the functions below. But originally, if you don't want to use that method, you have to write your functions. Your function should be above your main. Since you're writing your function, and let's say you want to call it in your main, that means you have to define everything in the function, then you call it. So I'll talk about this right now. And this doesn't really matter. You could have your functions above your main, but normally, since the main is like the most important place you're going to work in, and the functions are just, you can do minor tweaks to them. So we're going to do a little bit of a trick to basically bring your main function always on top instead of below. So I'm going to write it below for the sake of this, because I'm going to actually show you guys that trick as well. So the int main void function, don't need to do anything for now with that. So let's get started with our own function. So what we want is declare a function, and I've talked about earlier how you do it. So we need the data type that you want to return, which is an int in this case, since you're adding two integers together, and then the name of the function, which is basically add two ints. For example, you can name it anything you like, and it takes two parameters, right? Because we want two numbers and we want to add them up depending on user input. So yeah, let's do this. And so basically you need to do int a comma int b, let's say, or you could even do them n1 and n2, but for now we're just going to keep them a and b. So these are two inputs, and right now they're not getting user inputs because we're not running the function yet, and we're also not getting user input. So first of all, let's finish whatever's inside our actual function, then we can move on to it, of course. So yeah, now what we have to do here is just create another integer or a variable with an int data type called total. And what we do here is we do just a plus b, because we've already defined our data type, as I talked about earlier in the variables video. You don't really need to specify int a every single time. So yeah, a plus b. So the total is a plus b. And what we do now is actually very, very simple. We just want to return total. So every time you have a function, you would have to return a value to. So now we're returning total, Now we've already written our function. We can already bring it out of sight. We don't really need it. Let's just keep it there. And the way we actually do that trick I told you guys is we have to keep an instance of our basically function up here. So to int, we're not really defining our function again. We're just giving it the necessary things you need to go through the code again and just check that there's a function and just give it a reference to this function below here. So let's say if it goes here and it's like, where's the function? Well, this part actually is pointing to this part. So it run this function. So yeah, now what we want to do is get two integers, user based. So int, let's name it n1, and let's use get int for now. Later on, we're gonna do something else as well. Positive, sorry, just enter a number. A number. Let's copy this prompt. Semicolon. Got. Okay. Now we want to name this n2, and maybe this time to make it less confusing, enter another number. Okay, so now we have our two inputs. But how do we use our function in this main void? Well, it's actually pretty simple. What we need to do is let's put our function inside of a variable, as we call it basically. So let's just call it int, for example, final. Fn, for example, final number. So fn int fn, and then we have our add to ints function. So add to underscore ints, and then instead of having a and b, we want to input our user prompted numbers. So n1 comma n2, and we don't need to specify the data type because we've already done over here. So yes, now we have our variable, and now what we want to do is just print it out. Print f, and then we do %i since it's an integer, comma fn, our final number. So now let's test it out. So we have to make functions. Oops, okay, there's an error. Okay, so the error is basically we forgot to include this library, studio.h. So let's try it out again. Make functions. Okay, there you go. The errors are gone. Functions, and now once we run it, it asks us for a number. So let's give it, for example, 5 and 6, for example. As you guys can see, 11. So this is a basic way of just, you could do this without a function. I'm just teaching you guys some easy examples of doing something with a function. So later on you can do basically whatever you like. Okay, so let's move on to our next example, which is converting Celsius into Fahrenheit. So you might need to do that as well. So yes, since we don't need this, we can silent it. And now we want to write our int main void function again, since we're using it. Int main void. Okay, now we have our void function. Now what we want to do is just shrink this down a bit. We don't really need that much. Okay, so we don't really need to touch the int main void function yet because we haven't written our convert function basically. So we want to convert Celsius into Fahrenheit. But how do we do that? Well, actually, for converting that, you would need to input, of course, your Celsius input as a parameter of the function. And the formula you need to follow is basically your temperature, in Celsius, multiplied by 1.8 plus 32. So that's a very simple formula that we need to follow. And I'm just teaching you guys this because it's very simple. It's instead of adding them and just using a different formula. So, but this time we want to return a float value. And how do we return a float value? Well, we can't just write int convert, right? Since we've talked about this earlier, that the return type should be the data type that you want to return, in this case being a float, because sometimes it can be a bit messy and give us a few decimals. We're going to change that as well. So let's name it convert, and we want to take int t as temperature, for example. Now let's open our function. Now inside we want to write float Fahrenheit. Okay, and we want to do this formula that I told you guys. So t multiplied by 1.8 plus 32. Very simple formula. You can do this as well. And we want to return Fahrenheit in this case. So return Fahrenheit. So our function is basically done. It's very, very simple. And again, we have to do the same thing. So float convert int t. So this is basically referencing our function down here, that we don't need to put our function up here itself. Or you could do that as well. If you like your main function to be below and you don't like these extra lines over here, you could do that as well. So yeah, what we need to do now is get the user input. So let's just name it, for example, float n1, equals to get float, and we want to input temperature. Let's copy paste this over here. I made a mistake. Okay, yes. Now we have our input, which is N1, let's say, and what we want to do is put our basically let's print it out now. Printf, and what we want to do is print out float. So this is a float this time, but let's just maximize it to 1 decimal point, so we don't really need that much decimal points. \n, don't forget about that, comma, and let's basically here we can just do convert and give it N1 in this case, basically. And I think we are done. It's a bit confusing over here, might be a bit confusing, but this bracket is for this one and this is for the whole thing. So now it should work, and now let's test it out. So make functions dot, okay, good, no errors, dot slash functions. Now we want to input, okay, this is not really a good way to do it. I'll just do that. Okay, so let's just name, for example, 21 Celsius, 20 degrees Celsius, so 69.8. Okay, so as you guys can see, I'm in Google now itself. So now let's test out our actual function with using Google this time. So I inputted 21 degrees Celsius, so 21 is 69.8. As you can see, it matches the output number that we have over here. So yeah, that's it for the examples. These are just very simple examples. You can also mess around with some stuff that you would like as well. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section below. And thank you for watching. Please give this video a like, subscribe, and also hit that bell icon because it makes you notified every time I upload. Thank you for watching this video, and bye bye.